Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar entitled Operation Management in the Age of the Sharing Economy, What is Old and What's New. We are glad today to feature Professor Saif bin Jafar, who will be delivering this talk. A brief note about Professor bin Jafar. He's a full professor and head of the Industrial and System Engineering Department in the University of Minnesota, where he's also the director of the initiative on the sharing economy. Well, actually, it might take me more than the seminar itself to go through all Professor bin Jafar achievements. But in a few lines, I guess all of us today here with a background or interest in operation management, we should could have came across some of Professor Jafar work and research. As I mentioned, he's currently handling the Department of Industrial and System Engineering at the University of Minnesota. He's also founding member of the Singapore University of Technology and Design. He's the editor. He's editor-in-chief in the important journal Service System, Service Science, and I guess he have a publication in very top journals in the field, and I guess he's a recognized a scholar and top researcher in the field of management science and operations research. Professor bin Jafar has been recently elected as a fellow of Informants, and I'll take this opportunity to congratulate him on such a well-deserved distinction and recognition. I guess Professor bin Jafar is the best actually speaker today. I would like to thank him for taking some of his time on a Sunday, which is supposed to be a weekend in Minnesota, to deliver us his thoughts and ideas about the sharing economy. It's a very interesting and booming trend in both industry and research. And Professor bin Jafar, I guess, is among the first scholar and researcher to set, I think, the first foundations on how researcher in management science and operation research could contribute and look at all of these economy that are rising and booming and enabled by these internet and these internet platforms, and there are too many examples. And a final thought for we have today many young, I would say, researcher, student, and PhD. Those of you who wants to be always on looking on what is the research or the top research trend in operation research and management science, keep an eye on what Professor bin Jafar is doing. It's always on the recent and impactful research. So today's seminar will be moderated by myself, Adel Al-Omri. I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Engineering Management and Decision Science at the College of Science and Engineering at Hamad bin Khalifa University, as well as with my colleague, Professor Lausin Al-Karbesh, who is a full professor in our division as well. So briefly, how the session will be ongoing. So first of all, Professor bin Jafar will be giving his talk about the sharing economy, and will be sharing with us his expertise in this field. Then we will move to a session of a question and answer to take this, and this is actually an opportunity for all of you guys here to have Professor bin Jafar with us today. So please take this chance to ask your questions. And for those of you who don't know how to ask questions through the WebEx platform, it's quite easy. So there is actually a question and answer tab in the right hand side of the WebEx screen. So you just hit the button and then address your questions to all panelists. so that we make sure that we read all of your questions. We will do our best at the end of the session to address and answer as many as we can. Here, actually, some screenshots to help you finding this question and answer tab done by our colleague Azadeen, which I thank for the IT support he's provided for us. So either you are on the WebEx, on a computer, or on mobile, it's quite easy. So here it's on a mobile, or on the right side hand, you just see the three dots, click there, and then you find the question and answer session. So thank you very much. Without any further ado, I'll leave the digital floor for Professor Bajaf.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here with you, if not in person, virtually. Thank you, Adil, for that very kind introduction. So Adil and I go a long way back, and Adil actually spent some time here in Minnesota many years ago, and we worked on a few papers. So it's nice to reconnect. As Adil mentioned, today I'm going to talk to you about this topic of sharing economy. So I've been working on this with colleagues here in Minnesota, but also around the world for the last 8 years or so. What I'm going to do is really give kind of a high-level overview. If time allows it, I will spend the last maybe 10 minutes of the talk describing something more technical. Okay, an example of a model that captures some of these features. Let's see. For those of you who are interested in learning more about this, this paper is, this talk is based on this paper, also based on other papers, but this is a nice starting point. So take a look at it. It's available for download. Actually, there's free access for this paper from the MSOM journal. Okay. Let's see. So the objective of the talk is as follows. So I'm going to try and highlight unique features that distinguish certain sharing economy applications, and discuss the need for different approaches and models. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how sharing economy presents us with a different context where some of the traditional ideas from operations management, supply chains may not apply. Then discuss some recent research as it pertains to key sharing economy applications. I will try and draw connection to classical OM, if you may. So traditional OM problems and approaches and techniques that are needed to tackle sharing economy applications. Then discuss some open questions, opportunities for future research. So I'm going to use the term sharing economy in a fairly narrow sense to describe business models built around on-demand access to products and services that are mediated by online platforms that match many suppliers or service providers to many small buyers. Okay, so peer-to-peer interaction that are mediated by a platform. Also to refer to on-demand access to products and services provided by a single entity to many small buyers. Okay, so you can think of the first category as being P2P or peer-to-peer. The second one is B2C or business to consumer. There are many companies that are built around these ideas. I'm sure you're familiar with many of these. These are examples from the US. Perhaps some of these operate in Qatar, but Uber is an example of a peer-to-peer where there's a platform that sits between service provider, drivers who offer seats in their cars, who offer rides, and then riders, right? An example of a B2C would be like a bike share system or a car share system. where the vehicles are owned by a single entity, but offered for short-term rental on on-demand basis. There are other manifestations of the sharing economy that involve the matching of many buyers and suppliers mediated by online platforms. Some examples include funding platforms, for example, that match small borrowers and entrepreneurs with small lenders and investors. Information platforms that provide peer-to-peer instruction, reviews, and advice. Peer-to-peer marketplaces that involve the buying and selling of goods and services. The growth in the sharing economy, so I've seen an explosion of businesses that are taking advantages of these ideas and these P2P interactions and this on-demand access to product and services. This growth is taking advantage of, first, excess capacity from many categories of products. So a good example is a car, right? So it's an expensive asset that tends to be poorly utilized, right? The typical percentage of time a car is used in the US is about 5%. People will use it maybe for a couple of hours, often much less per day. The rest of the time it's sitting idle, occupying valuable space, but also depreciating in value. So there's an opportunity now to tap into that excess capacity. This is also enabled by online platforms that have significantly reduced transaction costs, if you may. So search cost, the handling of payments, the building of trust among strangers. So these platforms allow to weed out bad actors using these two-way reputation systems. And then there are changes, demographic changes, cultural changes, right? Increased population density, the increased interest for sustainability, and generational shift in attitudes toward ownership. Okay, so that's kind of the broad background. What I would like to do next is be a little bit more concrete, and I'm going to describe to you three example applications that have particularly captured the attention of researchers in the OM/OR field. Okay, so the first one is peer-to-peer resource sharing. Second one is on-demand service platforms. And the third one is on-demand rental networks. So we'll start with the first one. Hopefully we'll be able to cover all three, but it's okay also if we cover the first two and then maybe discuss the rest during the Q&A. Okay, so peer-to-peer resource sharing describes the situation where there's some asset that is shareable, like a car, for example, and you have owners who are now willing to rent their assets on a short-term basis to non-owners. So you can envision a reality where when you're not driving your car, instead of your car sitting idle waiting for you in a parking garage or at the garage at home, there's now an opportunity to have that car signed up onto an app and available to be rented by others. Okay, this provides an opportunity to leverage this poorly utilized asset. Some individuals may choose to own, others, if this option of sharing is available, some individuals may choose to own, others may choose to rent from those who own. And one of the things that may drive these decisions is the fact that we all have different levels of usage, right? Some people are heavy users of this asset, so they probably prefer to own it. Others may be casual users of the asset. And because of that, renting whenever they need is probably, if that option is available, is probably preferable, right? These choices, in addition to the level of usage, were also different in terms of our sensitivity to the inconvenience associated with renting things rather than owning them, right? So that's another feature, right, that may define whether somebody ends up renting versus owning. The prevailing rental price is also a factor, and then the likelihood of a successful match between an owner and a non-owner. So whenever you want to rent, how likely is it that you're going to be able to find an available car? For example, if this is a car that's being shared. This is from the perspective of the renter. From the perspective of the owner, you worry about if you're going to go through the hassle of putting your car up on a platform, making it available in this way. You would like the likelihood that your car will be rented to also be high, right? As I mentioned, there are many examples of this. A car is perhaps the best illustration of this, but you could also think of other type of assets. For example, if you own a vacation home that you use only occasionally, that there's also an opportunity there to leverage that excess capacity you have on this vacation home. So this is a slide that shows example businesses around the world that enable this P2P sharing of cars. So this P2P sharing creates essentially a marketplace for this excess capacity. Okay, this is, however, different from a traditional market in several aspects. The first one is that you have many buyers and sellers. So those of you who are studying supply chains will be familiar with kind of a traditional relationship between a supplier and a buyer. It's a manufacturer and a distributor, or a distributor and a retailer, right? It's a one-to-one relationship. This is a many-to-many relationship. So that's feature number one. Feature number two is the supply side is not distinct from the buy side. Because if you have more owners, that means fewer renters. And if you have more renters, that means fewer owners, right? So supply and demand interact in this way. More supply means less demand, and less demand. More demand means less supply. The third feature is that this is a setting where supply actually stimulates demand, right? The fact that there are many cars that are available to rent will encourage you to potentially rent, because you know that the likelihood of finding a car when you need one is high. And vice versa, right? If you know there are potentially lots of renters who are available to rent your car, then you'd be more willing to to participate and put your car up for rent when you're not using it. And the fourth feature of this economy, of this market, is that a single resource unit can sustain the consumption of multiple consumers. Right. So some of you who took, those of you who took economics, right, we typically think of demand as each customer will consume a single unit of demand. Okay. So here, a single unit of supply. Here, a single unit of supply could sustain multiple consumers. Listed here a few examples of research questions. Some of these, there are already papers that have sort of tried to address these questions, including some of the work we did. Others kind of remain open, and an opportunity for those of you who are looking for research topics. So let's see. So some examples would be around pricing. So how should the platform price its services to owners and non-owners? So knowing the dynamics of this market, right? How should the platform decide on prices? How should the platform match owners with non-owners, especially in setting where resources, individual preferences are heterogeneous? So if you have a market, let's say, with different customer classes, right, wanting different types of cars, for example, and customers who provide different types of cars, and I might have some ordered preference for some feature over others in the cars I rent. If you're the platform, how should you do this matching so as to maximize the overall satisfaction of your consumer base? How much effort should the platform exert in reducing market friction? Often this is costly, right? So how much effort should they exert in reducing inconvenience and reducing this moral hazard, improving matching, increasing matching efficiency, and so on? And then if you think about it, this also changes the possibility that now, for example, a car could be shared after it's bought, right? It changes the market for the manufacturer of the car. So if you know that the car you're going to sell is going to end up being shared in this P2P fashion, you as a manufacturer, how should you respond? How should you change your pricing? How should you change the durability of your product? Should you try and encourage, for example, the sharing of your product in this aftermarket or not, or discourage it? Other research questions are kind of more societal, which is what is the impact on ownership? If now it's possible to do this peer-to-peer sharing, is this going to likely to reduce ownership? For example, reduce the overall number of cars that are bought, or is it going to increase it? Is it likely to reduce the usage of these assets or increase them? What is the overall impact on consumer surplus, social welfare? What is the impact on the environment? Are there, especially when there are negative externality associated with either ownership or usage? So the advocates of the sharing economy will often argue that instead of everyone owning, some people owning, and when they're not using, sharing this asset with others is a more sustainable way of consuming. In the sense that may reduce the base of products that are needed to support the same level of consumption. Is this necessarily true? Is it true that actually the overall number of assets end up being less? But also, what would happen to usage, right? So if you go through this thought experiment, right? So on one hand, you have a peer-to-peer sharing can curtail ownership because individuals have the option of renting instead of owning, right? But on the other hand, it can make ownership more attractive as the rental income could make owning more affordable. So somebody who couldn't afford a car, now they could afford it because they're going to subsidize the cost of ownership through this rental income that they're going to generate by renting their car. Also, shared product experience more usage, potentially resulting in more negative externalities associated with usage, increased congestion, for example, on the road. So these are questions that affect society. It also affects a manufacturer. As I mentioned before, from the perspective of a manufacturer, how should they price products and when should they encourage sharing versus discouraging it? So there's a bit of background and sort of big picture on P2P product sharing. In this paper, we have tried to answer some of these questions. So one of the things we try to do is capture these dynamics of P2P owning and renting and decisions about the platform. And so there's a lot of strategic behavior taking place here. So if you decide to own, you have to take into account who else is going to decide to own and how many people are going to be available to rent the product you own, and then how is the platform going to respond in terms of pricing. So in this paper, we built a model, a game theoretic model that captures the strategic behavior of these various parties. And we use the model to then try and understand what happens in equilibrium, right? In terms of what would be the prevailing prices, how much ownership would we end up seeing, how much usage we end up seeing, and try to answer these societal questions, okay, in terms of whether we end up indeed with less ownership and less usage or not, okay? I'm not going to show any math. I'm going to skip through the model if you're interested to take a look at the paper, but I'll just show this picture here that kind of summarizes the result. And the answer is nuanced, right? You could end up in an equilibrium where indeed P2P sharing helps from a sustainability perspective. So you end up with less ownership and less usage. But you could also end up in a regime or an equilibrium where we have more ownership and more usage. And it turns out that this crucially depends on the cost of ownership. So if the product is expensive, what our analysis shows is that you're more likely to end up in a situation where once sharing is possible, that actually you end up with, if this is a sharing of cars, you end up with more cars on the road and these cars driven more often. Okay, so I was living in Singapore, as Adil mentioned, for a number of years, and there the cost of owning cars is very high. So what this result, for example, says in that setting is that if you introduce P2P sharing, the possibility of P2P sharing in a place like Singapore, you're going to end up actually with more cars and more traffic. Okay. And the reason is that your starting base is one, because the cost of ownership of a car right now is high. Not many people own. So by having this possibility of sharing, more people end up owning because now they're going to be able to subsidize the cost of this expensive car. And they're very likely to find the renters, so that income is pretty much guaranteed, because not too many people own. The reverse is true when the cost of ownership is low. So if you live in a place like where I live now in Minnesota, where the cost of owning a car is pretty low, you introduce this P2P sharing possibility and actually you end up with less ownership and less usage, kind of for the reverse reasons, right? Because there are many people who actually don't need the car a lot, but now they're forced to own one. If you offer this option, then they're likely to switch, given that the base of owners is pretty high. Given that if they were to do to make the switch, they're likely to find a car when they need one. Okay, so again, what this shows is that we need models like this to understand what could happen. And the answer is not black and white. So the answer in terms of at least the impact on sustainability is nuanced, okay? So resource sharing may or may not reduce the negative externalities associated with ownership and usage. And for sharing to lead to a reduction in both ownership and usage, either the cost of ownership has to be controlled, or the price that the platform charges has to be controlled. For example, capped, or subsidies or taxes on the cost of ownership imposed. Many opportunities to extend this model, validated empirically, carry out experiments. What we did was mathematical modeling and computational simulation. There's an opportunity to actually see if you can get validated with data and with experiments, or with actual by observing reality where a P2P has been introduced. Think about behavioral factors that enter into individual decision-making about owning and renting. What are inhibitors of trust among owners and renters, and what behavioral factor might determine how owners and renters rate each other, and so on. So there are a lot of these research questions I'm listed here, kind of behavioral, because we're actually in the process of doing some behavioral research where we're trying to understand how individuals, if offered this possibility, how do they make these decisions? Okay, so that's one application. The second application is this on-demand service platforms. This is another area where there's growing research in the OM field. And this is what I mean by an on-demand service platform. So this is a platform that sits between two parties. In this case, it sits between service providers, workers, and delay sensitive customers. Okay, so a good example of this is ride hailing, right? Like Uber or Lyft in the US. Okay, so you have potentially a pool of drivers on one end who would decide independently, right? They're independent agents who decide on whether or not to work for the platform, and if they do work for the platform, how long to work for the platform, and when, right? These workers respond obviously to to wage incentives, right? How much money are they going to make if they work for the platform? How much they make is driven by the nominal wage rate that the platform pays. So if you're driving for 10 minutes, how much the platform is going to pay you for that. But also they're sensitive to how busy they are, right? Since typically the platform will only pay you when you're actually busy doing things. And then on the other side, you have customers, right? The customers are sensitive to the price, how much they're going to pay, but they're also sensitive to delay. How long would they wait for the service to show up, right? So this is again a market. These are examples, right, of such platforms, right? The prominent examples in the transportation area, but also we're seeing it in other areas. So during the pandemic, food delivery became very popular in the US, and a lot of these companies like Postmate, DoorDash, right, rely on independent drivers. Customers are obviously delay sensitive. They want their food delivered quickly, but they're also sensitive to how much the platform charges them for these deliveries, and many more. So as I mentioned before, there's sort of this creates a market with its unique features, right? In a lot of the traditional service OM, we assume that capacity is fixed, right? Or it's the decisions that I make, right? And then I'm guaranteed supply. So if I'm running a call center, for example, I make a decision about how many agents do I need. Then I hire those agents, and then those agents are available to me for whatever number of shifts they're supposed to work, right? And now the situation is different, right? Uber doesn't hire drivers, and instead it offers a wage, right? It broadcasts a wage, announces a wage, and then drivers or potential drivers decide independently whether or not to supply labor to Uber. Okay, so you're not controlling supply directly, you're controlling it through this wage button, right? Because now agents only they're paid piecemeal. They only get paid when they're busy. As a driver, you also have in mind the size of the market, like how likely I'm going to get calls to drive people around. In a traditional setting, like a call center setting, right? The call center agent doesn't really care whether they're busy or not. Probably they prefer not to be busy because they're guaranteed an hourly wage, right? So there's not that interaction between supply and demand. So here's another example of a market where having more demand creates more supply. And vice versa. Having more supply also induces more demand because customers would know, right? If you're going to go on a platform, right, you're sensitive to the price, yes, like in a traditional market, but also you're sensitive to your understanding of what the delay is going to be. Right? If you think you're going to wait for an hour to get your food delivered, you may not go through that platform, right? But if you know that this platform has lots of drivers signed on and they're pretty quick, then you're more likely to use, right? So there's this kind of feedback loop that feeds on itself, right? Supply stimulates demand, demand stimulates supply, and so on. So these are, again, unique features to this supply chain, if you may, right? There's this three-way interaction with interesting dynamics, right? So this requires different kinds of modeling than what we're traditionally used to, right? We're traditionally used to think about demand being an independent process and supply being an independent process. In this case, demand and supply arise endogenously through the interaction between the two sides. So in these, what kind of supply and demand you end up with is affected by decision various parties make, particularly the platform, how the platform sets prices for example, matters, and how it sets wages matters, right? So the platform now has two buttons: is how much to charge customers, but also how much to pay the workers, right? In some settings, there are a third party involved, like in food delivery. You don't have just two sides. You actually have three sides to this market, the other side being the restaurants. So you have the drivers, the customers, and the restaurants, right? And there are transfer payments between these three parties, right? And how do you make these decisions about these payments affects outcomes in equilibrium. So in this paper, also available for download, if you're interested, you can take a look at it. We built a model, a queuing model with strategic, with customers and drivers behaving strategically. So it's a queuing model layered with a game theory model to try and predict what happens in equilibrium. So one of the questions we try to answer, again, I'm going to just show you one picture here, is what happens when these platforms grow. And one aspect of this growth is what happens when these platforms try and exert effort to recruit more workers. Right. So a lot of these platforms, because they know there's a kind of a positive feedback loop that can take place, right? They try and, especially in that early startup phase, to get as many drivers to work for them. And the question we try to answer is that growth actually helpful to the drivers or harmful? Right. So kind of the traditional view is that from the perspective of workers, if there are too many of these workers, then they compete with each other, right? Because now they're going to divide among themselves this market, right? And with each drivers coming on board, there's the slice of the pie I get of that market would be smaller, right? It turns out that is not necessarily the case always. Okay, so if you think about at the end of the day, how much money I take home as a driver, we show using our game theoretic model that it depends on whether how big that labor pool size is. So early on, let's say in the build-up phase, actually having more drivers join the platform is helpful to the drivers. And the reason is because having more drivers stimulates demand, encourages customer to join, because they know that with each additional driver, their delay is going to get cut down, right? Their queuing time is going to get cut down. Okay, so more workers then help the customers, which in turn helps the drivers. But eventually you get a point kind of saturation where delay now is pretty low. Once you get delay within a few minutes, right, throwing more drivers at it starts to stops having an effect on delay, but starts to hurt the drivers, because now that pie is fixed, that market becomes fixed because you're not able to stimulate it anymore with supply. And workers now start to compete with each other for this fixed pie. So there are kind of two phases: an early phase where more demand, where more workers helps the workers in terms of their take-home pay. But eventually you get into a second phase where having more workers starts to hurt. So why is this important? Because there's a big debate about whether these platforms should be regulated or not. So, for example, New York City here in the US has enacted a regulation that caps the total number of drivers to about 100,000. Okay. And what this shows that whether 100,000 is the right number or not, right, depends on whether I'm in this congested regime or not. So early on, ideally, regulators should be hands off, okay? And only when the platform has grown sufficiently that regulation will start to make sense. Let's see. There are other research directions. There are many opportunities to do things in this area. Again, we're still starting to. We're only starting to scratch the surface here. Here too, there are opportunities to extend the model, but also validate the findings empirically, carry out experiments. Again, trying to understand behavior. So we have a model of how workers behave, of how consumers behave, but it would be nice if that's grounded in actual behavioral research. And again, I'm actually working with some colleagues here in the business school where we're doing experiments with human subjects to understand better decisions that both parties make in response to various incentives. Okay. Here's a third application, and I don't know, Adel, if I have a little bit more time, I can spend 5 minutes on this, or I can stop here. It's up to you.
Still, we have some time. Yes.
Okay.
Please, audience, just please ask your question on the go on the Q&A tab.
Okay. All right. So the third application is what we're calling here on-demand rental networks. So the first two applications I showed you and discussed with you were P2P, right? Peer-to-peer. This one is B2C. So examples of this is bike share system, scooter share systems, car share systems, where you have one entity that owns the assets and then puts out these assets up for rent on an on-demand basis. How is this different from a traditional model of selling a product or a service? I've listed here a few of these distinctive features. So again, products and services here are provided by a single firm that retains ownership of the underlying resources. A feature is this on-demand feature, right? So you don't need to book these things typically in advance, right? You don't need to make an appointment, right? Product can be also rented on a short-term basis, right? Sometimes you could rent a bike for a few minutes and then release it. Assets are geographically distributed over multiple locations, so there's a spatial aspect to this, but it is also a setting with multiple locations of where the assets are, right? So if you come from the supply chain world, this is a world where inventory is distributed spatially across multiple locations. There's randomness in the demand at each location. So generally, we don't know when a customer is going to show up and how many customers are going to show up per hour or per time of day. There's also randomness in the rental duration. And there's randomness in when a customer, typically many of these services operate in a one-way type of system where you can pick up the asset in one location and drop it off in another location. You can rent the bike from location A and drop it off to location B. You don't have to return it back to the same location. And then you have customers sensitive to distance, sensitive to price, also sensitive to inventory availability. Okay. Some of the research questions there are many research questions that would come to mind, right? For example, how big should the service region be? If you're going to deploy such a system, right, over how many locations should you have and how widespread these locations should be? Where to place pickup and drop-off points, if any? How big should the fleet size be, given your service region and a target service level? How often and how much should inventory be rebalanced, right? Because of this randomness in demand at different location and randomness in where the inventory ends up. You pick it up in one location, drop it off in another location. You could have situations where you have lots of inventory in one place and very little or none in another, right? So there's a need in many of these applications to go in and move stuff around to create a better balance. And then how should the owner of these assets, the operator, price the service? And let's see. Prior to the pandemic, I was in Shanghai, in China, and there I saw sites like this. And I don't know if you have seen some of these stories, right, about bike share systems in China, which were deployed at a very large scale, have, for the most part, failed spectacularly, right? So hundreds of thousands of these bikes at some point were operating in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and others, right? And most of them ended up stopping service or failing, and we ended up with a situation with like these giant graveyards of bikes. Okay. So this has intrigued us. Like, why did this happen? Why did this service fail? Okay, and this paper, also available for download, tried to look at this problem from the perspective of what we're calling here dimensioning of on-demand vehicle sharing systems. So we tried to answer the question of how big a fleet size should be, and as you will see, as I will describe briefly, this has a connection with that with those spectacular failures. Okay, so the problem we try to address is what is the minimum number of vehicles needed to guarantee a specified service level. So by service level, I mean the probability that a customer finds an available vehicle at their preferred location when they want one, right? When you want to get when you want to find the bike, there's a bike available to you. When you want to find a car, there's a car available to you. Okay, and right. So to answer this question, right, we built a queuing network model. So you can it's very, once you sort of think about how the system operates, right, it becomes natural to think of it as a queuing system, right? You have a different location where you have these assets. So you can think of these as servers in a queuing system. Customers come and then if they're patient, maybe they would wait if they don't find one. But typically a customer will come. If they don't find the server available or a vehicle available, a bike available, they tend to go away. Okay, but if they find one, right, they drive it for some random amount of time and then drop it off elsewhere. Okay, so it's just a little simulation here of the dynamics of the system. So I could start out with a nice balanced system of three bikes in each location. Then somebody rents something from location 1 and drop it off at location 2. So now I have two bikes in location 1, 4 bikes in location 2, and 3 bikes in each of location 3 and 4. Next, a customer comes, picks up a bike at location 3, drops it off at 4. So now I have 2 bikes in 2 locations and 4 bikes in the other 2 locations. Then a customer picks up a bike from location 3, drops it off at location 2. And now I have 5 bikes in location 2, 2 in location 1, 1 in location 3, and 4 in location 4. So you can see how imbalance could be created in the system, and how the system where we started out with kind of a queuing system with a similar number of servers in each location, I end up with different servers at different locations, right? So this creates a new type of randomness that doesn't exist in a classical queuing system or service system, where if I hired agents in a call center, the same number of agents will be available to me at that call center. Or if I hire checkout people to do checkout at the store, the same number of checkout agents will be available. Here I end up with a situation where the number of servers is also random. So it's a new source of randomness. And it turns out that this This feature, the fact that these servers roam, that these vehicles roam, and not attached to a specific queue, has an important implication of how big the system needs to be in order to guarantee a specified service level, right? So standard queuing theory suggests that the optimal fleet size would be nominal load plus buffer capacity, right? If you're sizing a call center, for example, deciding on the number of agents in a call center, you'll basically the analysis will lead you to a result that looks like this. The optimal number of agents is kind of the average demand, right? Plus some buffer capacity. That's protection against variability in demand and service time, right? It turns out that now, because of this additional randomness, I need some extra buffer capacity. I'm going to skip through the analysis here. I was going to talk about show you a little bit of math here, but maybe I'll skip through it and show you what the optimal fleet size looks like when I have this feature of vehicles moving about, right, in the system. So the optimal fleet size ends up being consisting of, again, nominal load, consistent with traditional queuing, and then some buffer capacity that's a function of variability in rental times and demand. But now you have this extra buffer capacity that's independent of demand, and that's driven only by the number of locations. Okay, so we attribute this to this roaming feature, because if you didn't have the roaming feature, this component will disappear. And as you can see here, this additional now buffer capacity scales linearly with the number of location and exponentially with the number of servers. Okay, so if we compare, for example, so one thing is that because this is independent of demand, right? It does not depend on demand. So even if demand is very small, in order to vanishingly small, it's like close to zero, you still potentially could need significant number of vehicles. Okay, so for example, if you have a system with just 2 locations with nearly zero demand, right? That says n-1 divided by alpha over 1 minus alpha, where alpha is, let's say, 0.95, right? You want with 95% certainty to guarantee a bike when somebody wants one, right? This means that you would need 19 vehicles. Okay, even though the demand is negligible. Contrast this with the 2 vehicles needed in the absence of this roaming feature. So if you had vehicles return to the same location after each trip instead of possibly going elsewhere, right? Then standard analysis, but also simple logic will say that I would need, given that the demand is very low, I would need at most 2 vehicles, right? So this kind of illustrates this new, right, how this new dimension, the flexibility that individuals could drop off a bike anywhere they want, right, introduces a need for significantly more capacity. Okay, all right, so I'm going to, okay, so maybe I'll just skip through that and then just, again, reiterate this point that one-way vehicle sharing system may require significantly more vehicles. And perhaps this explains, right? So in other words, in order to make these systems work in terms of guaranteeing an acceptable service level, you need to throw a lot of capacity at them, right? So we saw that with just two locations, you need at least 19 vehicles. In these places in China, right, they had hundreds, thousands of locations, with ambitions of guaranteeing actually even higher service levels. Almost with certainty, you can find a bike, okay? So then, right, they write that formula for capacity, right, for the optimal fleet size, right, will suggest that you will need a very large number of bikes to kind of to sustain such a service, right? And it's sort of that's what ended up happening, right? In a lot of these places, literally hundreds of thousands of bikes were thrown into the system in cities like Shanghai and Beijing and elsewhere in China, right? But then the economics cannot support it, right? Because the demand to make this profitable was not there. And as we saw, even if the demand is low, you still need lots of bikes. Okay, all right. So maybe I will conclude with these last couple of slides here, and then we'll stop for Q&A. Let me just make some connection I hope I illustrated how these new applications have distinctive features from traditional application in operations management and supply chains. But let me emphasize this by connecting things to kind of traditional topics in OM. First one is inventory theory, revenue management, and third one, queuing system. So those of you who took an inventory theory class, an inventory management class, right, the focus of inventory management is on controlling supply. And a lot of sharing economy applications, supply is not controlled. It's an uncontrolled process, right? If you think about the supply of workers, for example, in an on-demand service platform, that's not something you control. You control it only directly through the incentive of wage. So the focus in these applications is really not as much about controlling supply, but what do you do with the available supply? So supply is kind of showing up dynamically over time. Same thing with demand. So a lot of the effort is on matching supply and demand, right, to maximize sort of the fit. Revenue management, which is right, it deals with pricing basically in marketplaces. A lot of revenue management was one-sided. You only deciding on prices to charge customers. In a platform setting, you have two sides. You have to decide on what's the price you're going to charge customers, but also what's the wage to pay workers. And in some applications, as we mentioned, you could have a third side or a fourth side, like a restaurant side in the case of food delivery. And then you have to think about how much you're going to charge the restaurant for offering them this service. All right. So this adds another dimension, complication to traditional revenue management. And then queuing theory, right, which is maybe the third pillar of operations management. As we saw, traditional queuing theory assumes fixed number of servers. Here, number of servers are now random, and I have to kind of reinvent machinery analysis theory to deal with queuing systems where the number of servers is random. In terms of opportunity for future research, sort of all of this is open field, really, and there's some work is being done now, but still room to do a lot more. A lot of the recent research is focused on situation where you have a single platform, so monopoly, if you may, mediating this market. But there's an opportunity to look at platforms that compete, right? So you have an Uber and a Lyft competing, for example. A lot of the research deals with two sides in these marketplaces. There's an opportunity to extend the analysis to multiple sides. Increasingly, there's an interest in how automation might affect things. For example, if you have the possibility of deploying automated vehicles in a service like Uber, right, ride-hailing service, what would that do to the quality of service, to how you price it, to how you decide how many of these AVs. And at least in the near future, you'll typically have a mixed service, right? With some cars being driven by humans and others being AV. What's the right mix? How is that combination going to work? And again, a lot of the existing work is theoretical in nature, and I think we need to ground more of this work in empirical data, empirical evidence. I'm going to stop here. So lots of interesting problems. Opportunity for OR, OM to be really at the forefront of this area and to help with ideas in terms of business and social innovation, and then for us to also inform policy debate. Plug for this special issue of on the sharing economy for MSOM. The MSOM is one of these good journals. So we have an co-editing with Minghu, a special issue on this topic. So keep an eye for it. And then, as Adil mentioned, I'm editor-in-chief of this journal, Service Science, and I would encourage colleagues here to consider the journal for submission, particularly in these new innovative areas. I'll stop here. Questions, comments, ideas? That's our future, by the way. We're all stuck in one tiny car. Okay. Adil, take it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Saif. Very, very dense topic, very ambitious. I haven't looked at the questions yet from the audience. I just have a first question. I think you are kind of the upfront of something that is very new in terms of paradigms in operation management, I would say in service management. And so I was wondering if by looking at the three canonical applications that are different, but then at the end, when you were looking at all the new, OM, etc., you highlighted three common grounds. The first one is the inventory theory, revenue management, and queuing theory. Do you think with these three kind of pillars, you'll be able to kind of integrate all these different canonical applications?
Well, let's see. I think a lot of the technical underpinnings of, let's say, inventory theory, which is, uses a lot of inventory theory is about making decisions dynamically over time, right? So dynamic programming or dynamic optimization is the tool, right, of choice in making decisions about inventory. I think that tool of dynamic optimization applies in this setting, except that now we are not, again, trying to decide when to order, right? Classic inventory theory, you look at your current level of inventory, your sense of where the demand is going to be in the future, and you decide on when to order and how much to order. That's not something you can do in a lot of these sharing economy applications. But what you can do is decide on what is the best way to do matching. So you have some supply available to you, possibly of different type, and some demand available to you, possibly of different type. And the decision is which matches should I undertake. So in the context of, for example, ride hailing like Uber, you have customers in different locations who are needing rides and drivers in different locations available to offer those rides, right? And the decision is really what is the best driver to match with the best rider, right? But the underlying tool could be still dynamic programming, for example. The same thing for understanding the dynamics of some of these on-demand services, like queuing is still a concern, right? Whenever you have customers caring about delay, right? And you have customers arriving over time, dynamically over time, and supply becoming available over time. It's very natural to resort to queuing analysis. So I would say these traditional tools are still relevant and useful in these new applications.
So my other question, and then I have some questions from the audience, is, you have been working on this for you said 8 years, 10 years, etc. And I'm surprised, I don't know, because queuing theory seems to be the way to go because of the service aspect of it. Except that a lot of the queuing models, in this case, I haven't really got into it in details, but they seem to be non-stationary processes because you don't have your capacity. You keep saying the supply is non-stationary. It's almost infinite, and then of course then you have different behaviors. And I was wondering is how complex are the queuing models that you're using? Are they these complex queuing networks, or you using kind of isolated stations with some of the basic features and characteristic of Poisson processes, etc.?
So let's see. So in some of these applications, that supply is both the demand and supply are endogenous. So a lot of traditional queuing, you assume that you have a specified arrival process with some arrival rate to your queuing system, and you assume that the number of servers is known to you, right? In these applications, neither one is known to you. Initially, you have a potential pool from which to draw demand, right? But only a fraction of that demand is realized, and you have a potential pool of servers from which to draw from, but only a fraction is realized based on the dynamics of the interaction between the two sides. So because of this, you need now an equilibrium analysis on top of the queuing model. So the effective arrival rate and the effective number of servers are things that emerge only in equilibrium. So you basically have a game theory model on top of integrated or on top of the queuing model. So that's one way things get complicated, right? Yeah, and then in some of the other applications where the number of servers move around, they're not stationary. There you need, there the extension is much simpler. I mean, you can think of this as a closed queuing system, right? Closed queuing network where the servers move around, but their number is constant, right?
Yeah, a finite population, yes.
Yeah, right. A constant population, that's right. But what's been done is how do we optimize over a system like that?
Okay, I have a question from one of the participants. In fact, he's assistant professor in our department. I think it's from Breno. And he's asking you, would there be sharing economy concept that can be used for manufacturing through flexible manufacturing or in the logistics sector, specifically on the value-adding services?
All right. Yeah, excellent questions. So we're currently working with the 3D printing manufacturing company, Stratasys. They make 3D printers, and 3D printers are an example of an asset that is not that's expensive to own, but typically not used all the time, right? Because it's typically used for prototyping and things like that. So often companies that own 3D printers, but also individuals own 3D printers, right, have this excess capacity. And so what Stratasys has started is a platform that connects the owners of 3D printers to people who have 3D printing needs, right? So you can go on the platform, and if you have something that you would like 3D printed, you kind of look on the network, and are there people with 3D printers or companies with 3D printers around you that can fulfill your need. So this is an example where sort of manufacturing capacity is shared in this way. And the sharing could be among individuals in the case of individual 3D printers, but also could be, I don't know, factory capacity. One could imagine something like that, right? If you have generic kind of a machine shop that is or job shop that has generic capabilities, then you can imagine a network of such job shops sharing their capacity in a dynamic way.
Thank you, Saif. I'll jump in. Actually, I have one question, but I'll give you maybe a few questions from the audience with probably a kind of short answer, and then so that we can have also some time to debate. So first question, I guess, from one of the audience is about applications of crowdsourcing to raise huge funds, big funds for huge, let's say, mega projects. Are this research what you do could apply to this or not necessarily the case?
Mm-hmm. I mean, crowdfunding is a huge area of research. I mean, a growing area of research. There's a lot of interest. Lots of people are working in that space. It's not something I have personally worked on, but yes, yeah, I think it's a very interesting. Peer-to-peer lending, social lending is all very interesting. There's also an opportunity to do microfinance and to bypass banks, right? To bypass traditional financial institution and to allow kind of small lenders to participate.
There is another question about one of our students asking about can we assume or can we say that the P2P system is better than B2C in order to deal better with market fluctuations and being more tolerant to crises like what we are living now, a pandemic or something like that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent observation. Yes, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. In fact, right, services like Uber, on purpose, Uber doesn't want to own the cars, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't want to own the cars because they don't want to commit to a specific number of cars. They want to be able to dial up supply or dial it down, right? And the way a company like Uber does it is through surge pricing. When the demand is high, they will offer higher wages to the workers, so more workers jump in, right? And when the demand is low, they dial that wage button down, and that will discourage workers. So it gives them a great deal of flexibility. But there's a concern about whether this is fair to the workers, right? Because now, as a worker, you're facing more uncertainty about your income. There's more income uncertainty. Yeah.
Maybe I just have a question while probably Lausin, you could look at the audience questions to pick up some more. I have a question, probably a more high-level question. Recently, before maybe the crisis, we've been seeing there is kind of a divide between the sharing economy and what is commonly known as the traditional economy. So there are strikes. The taxi drivers, they don't like the Uber system. We have issue hotel versus Airbnb. People that are claiming that these platforms need to pay tax. And there is kind of a conflict and a clear divide between the two systems. On the other hand, now the advances in technology, the 5G, the dependency to internet and so on is more likely towards boosting more the sharing economy side. So my question to you as an expert in this, how do you see the future? Are we going to have this conflict, or are we going to reach some equilibrium, or probably some other people that are saying that the sharing economy would take over in probably 20, 30 years? So what do you think about this?
Whenever you have a disruptive technology, there's going to be winners and losers, right? The incumbents are not going to like it, right? When the car was introduced in the 1900s, right? The early 1900s, I'm sure a lot of the people who were in the business of selling horses were unhappy, right? And they went out of business. So there's going to be winners and losers. Now the question is the playing field leveled? like in the example of hotels you mentioned, hotels are subject to lots of regulation. You have safety and so on, right? The concerns and that add to the cost of operating a hotel. While Airbnb, right, and home sharing platforms are right now kind of operating in a regulatory void. Which is understandable early on, but we're getting now to a point that maybe some regulation, right, that levels the playing field is needed. Yeah, the same with the context of ride-hailing and Uber, and we're starting to see a bit of that. So California, for example, has introduced regulation to protect workers, to guarantee some benefits and so on. So yeah, I think regulation is needed, but with regulation, potentially this new mode of operation could actually be more desirable. I think the objections to on-demand service platform is not necessarily the format. In fact, the format is workers like it because it gives them flexibility. Now you can work whenever you want. For however long you want. There are some people who couldn't participate in full-time employment. Now they have opportunities to participate in this way. So it's broadening labor participation, but obviously you need also some protection. So I think.
Can we imagine that these regulations and tasks could at the end actually bring back the sharing economy to kind of traditional, let's say, economy? That's why these Uber and Lyfts and they are resisting to this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
it's going to cut their margin somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not only that, but also could change the model, because if you now start to treat, if you have to guarantee income, right? This goes now toward a model where like a full-time employment. I mean, the beauty of the business model is that you don't buy fixed capacity, right? You don't. When you hire, when an Uber driver participates, you don't tell them that you're going to earn this much today. You have that flexibility. So yeah, I mean, if we don't do this regulation carefully, that could actually kill the business model, right? And will right. I think in the long run, we're going to see models emerge where you can have platforms, for example, that offer benefits, retirement benefits to drivers, and perhaps hedge against income uncertainty, right? So you make some payments that will guarantee that if you work a certain number of hours and your income is below some amount, then this insurance kicks in, right? So there could be kind of secondary businesses that emerge to support this primary sharing businesses.
Before leaving back the mic to Lausin, I'll just pick up two quick questions from the audience. One of them is asking the extent of application of sharing economy in healthcare supply chains, in the healthcare industry. Mm-hmm. Are there some applications? Right. Not? If right. Yes.
Right. So telehealth is becoming big, right? With the pandemic, accessing doctors remotely, at least here in the US, has become the norm for a lot of routine stuff. And there are a few platforms have emerged that connects doctors to patients directly, bypassing kind of traditional healthcare organizations and big hospital systems and so on. So one could see situations like that, right, where you have a lot of independent doctors, right, having ability to reach a large base of doctors, or having the ability to reach a large base of patients in this way through a platform, and patients kind of connecting with doctors on on-demand basis. So you go in, log into a platform, and see which doctors is available for what specialties and at what price and so on. So yeah, so definitely there are opportunities. In fact, any kind of service work is amenable to some Uberification of that work.
I have maybe my last question here from the audience, and then I'll leave it back to Lausin. I guess one of the audience actually has been, let's say, hit by the picture you showed about the bikes in China. And he's asking about sharing economy and versus sustainability, in the sense, how are these platforms now paying more attention to end of life and recycling of the products, or they just leave it, since they are supposed to be only managing the platform, so they just leave it to the supplier themselves?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So in China, the two major players, Ofo and Mobikes, went out of business. Right, they went bankrupt, and the cities got stuck with these bike graveyards. Right, so these companies disappeared basically, and these bikes were left in the streets of Shanghai and Beijing for the city to kind of deal with them. And this is an extreme example, I think. Again, it all goes back to regulation. I think these services need to be regulated. And so here in Minnesota, for example, these scooters at some point became a big nuisance, because you could leave them anywhere, everywhere, and became a hazard. People will step over them, and people who were disabled on wheelchairs couldn't navigate the sidewalks because they were littered with these scooters. But I don't know, lately there's been some arrangement where now there are designated areas where you can leave these scooters around, and there's regulation on also, the city has negotiated how often these scooters have to be replaced, and so on. So I think thoughtful, careful regulation could steer us into better future.
Thank you very much, Saif. So I guess we are hitting the time limit. So from my side, I'm not asking more questions. Thank you very much, and I'll leave the concluding remarks probably for Lausin to take over.
Thank you, Adil. Thank you, Saif. Before I conclude, I just want to make sure that you get the big hello from Dr. Shaligran Bokharel from Qatar University, and he's the one who asked, okay, and he's the one who asked you the question about flexible manufacturing.
Yeah. Thank you, Shaligran, for that question.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much for your enlightening presentation. Very rich. We definitely need more time, so you should come back. And we can do it virtually. We can keep you maybe at least for half day. I think for our students, anyways, PhD and master students, and they have some very interesting questions that we could not convey them all to you. But so thank you for all the ideas that you put forward in terms of research questions, some of the potential frameworks that need to be developed. I think this connections that need to be made between the classical operation management theory with the new models from the service management, I think they are very, very important. We have seen, with COVID-19, all the problems that let's say, Adil asked you one of the questions from the healthcare sector. Okay, there's so many applications, in sharing economy, including one of the questions from one of our PhD students. He was asking you a question about eventually, can we share beds for chemotherapy and to increase the capacities and so on. So anyways, thank you so much for being available and generous in sharing all your knowledge, and also in spending and being patient and answering all the questions. Of course, I like also to thank Adil, who organized this. Thank you so much, Adil. Of course, I cannot forget Dr. Azzuddin and the technical team. They always doing a great job. And it's amazing that we having this webinar from Minnesota without any clicks at all. Thank you to all the attendees, students, faculty from HBKU, faculty from other universities. Probably I didn't see all the list, but probably people from outside. We like to thank the Dean of the College of Science and Engineering for providing us with these opportunities to do as many webinars as possible. Of course, we also thank the management of HBKU and Qatar Foundation. And you're always welcome anytime. And of course, don't forget we have a proposal pending on shared economy for the electrical vehicle on the on-demand services platform. So, and we even have a PhD students already working on one of the topic, and a new student is embarking on a topic also on the same topic on the integrated transportation system. So we need you, and so let's keep in touch. And thank you so much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure connecting with everyone. I hope the talk was useful, triggered some ideas, and yes, look forward to continuing the conversation.